Starfield is a mixed bag for me. On the one hand, the quests are amazing. Each one feels like it could play out in dozens of different ways, each having multiple outcomes based on my choices. But on the other hand, it's the straw that broke the camel's back for me, as it's still plagued with all the problems Bethesda Softworks has had for the last 20 years. I'm so annoyed that even when they've switched to an entirely new franchise, they still think it's acceptable to release a game with all the major faults of their previous titles, making no efforts to improve as a studio, only to produce more expansive games. So let's get into what those specific problems are, and how Starfield continues, or in some cases worsens, Bethesda's greatest failures. Now, you might think I'm going to say how the games are plagued with glitches and how it's unacceptable, but honestly, I don't really care about that. I've only ever played previous Bethesda games after launch when they've received extensive patches, so they don't really have that reputation in my mind, and Starfield worked great for me. I had a couple of crashes when I opened and closed the menu too fast, and I'm locked out of one side quest because there's a locked door where there definitely shouldn't be. So no, my problems with Bethesda's previous titles don't come from the technical side. They all come from the gameplay and design side. Firstly, and most chiefly, is their terrible combat. It's the most mindless, brain-dead, finicky combat I've ever seen from a studio of their prestige and talent. It all comes down to spamming your triggers to attack, and the only depth and strategy it has is how high the numbers on your gear are. You don't have to play around your opponent, just walk up to them and kill them. It's also basic. There's no strategy to it. Your armor will tank any hits, so you don't have to play around enemy attacks. Every enemy type has the same strategy to defeat, so there's no need to differentiate your tactics for different opponents. Again, it's the most basic and thoughtless combat I've ever seen from a studio of this size. Now, I know why the combat is like this, because of Bethesda's fantastic dedication to player choice. There are so many different ways you can build your character for combat. With so many options being included, it only makes sense that none of them in particular would feel that great. And combat and gameplay are never the focus of a Bethesda title. It's always the malleable stories that every player can craft differently. Combat is an afterthought. When you compare the gunplay to games with similar gameplay to Starfield, like Cyberpunk and Borderlands, you need to understand that combat is a core focus of those games, even above the story, and neither one of them matches Starfield's scale. Now, it's perfectly fine to disagree with me that Bethesda's combat is actually incredible, and that I'm just blatantly wrong, but Bethesda did release a game with no stories to get immersed in, and their combat was the main point of the game, and the majority of players roundly rejected it, and I'm sure you know how the rest of the story played out. Another thing that hasn't changed despite its obvious flaw is the inclusion of a stealth faction. In the Elder Scrolls, this is the Thieves Guild. In Starfield, it takes the form of Ryujin Industries. Now, there's nothing wrong with having a stealth faction per se. The problem arises when your game isn't built around stealth and provides next to no tools for the player to succeed unless they invest their skill points into attributes they're never going to use aside from this questline. Again, Bethesda games provide you with no way to successfully stealth until you upgrade, and why would you bother with stealth when shooting works just as well? Starfield actually makes this problem worse by not even having the hidden or detected meter be unlocked from the start. That's insanity! What's more is that the Ryujin questline eventually has you playing full-on Splinter Cell levels by the end, and it's so frustrating that the game isn't giving me the tools I need to succeed with this. However, the biggest problem is that Starfield stupidly continues its awful encumberment system. Why in the Daedra's name would you give me billions of items to pick up if you're going to constantly punish me for doing so? You've spent so much time creating all these assets lying around every inch of this game, yet if I collect even just a small amount of them, you're going to slow me down to a crawl unless I stop what I'm doing, slightly empty my inventory, and then travel to a store to sell them. This is how you stop the flow of the game and turn it into a tedious slog, jumping back and forth between your objectives and selling your loot. You have actively trained me to ignore 95% of everything lying on the ground, because the punishment of having to sell it all is outweighed by the meager amount of credits it provides. It's an absolutely ridiculous punishment for something you clearly put so much time into. Why give me infinite things to collect if you're going to punish me for doing so? It's a completely backwards mentality. Bethesda Softworks are some of the best developers in the industries, constantly turning out worlds for you to get lost in as you embroil yourself in every aspect of their design. But these games have serious issues, and unlike most developers who would look to fix what doesn't work with their games, Bethesda ignores all these issues and presses on and simply makes their games bigger, which only exacerbates the problem. And with Starfield being their biggest game to date, the problems that have plagued this studio for 2 decades are more prevalent than ever. I suppose at this point it's foolish to ever hope for them to be addressed, and Bethesda will always be a team that will forever look outwards and never within.